Hey there. I want to talk about a show that I watched recently, which blew my mind in how instructive it was for understanding how human beings live and what life is all about, and for putting together the bigger picture of self-actualization. And this is a reality TV show called Life Below Zero. Maybe you've seen it, maybe you've heard of it, maybe you haven't. If you haven't, then I highly recommend watching it, and I'll tell you why here in a second. Basically, this show is a sort of a survival show. It's very well done. It's not over-the-top, reality TV drama nonsense. It's quite realistic looking, although who can really tell, with these reality shows. But what it does is it tracks 4 different groups of people who live out in wild Alaska, like deep in the wilderness, pretty much all by themselves. And it puts a film crew with each one of these groups of people, and it just watches how these people live. And it shows that to you in kind of a raw fashion. And it's really interesting because all 4 of these groups of people, they live in different ways, but mostly they live sort of in log cabins out in the wilderness, in the forest, in the tundra, and they live there year-round in Alaska. They get terrible cold snows, like goes 50 below zero in certain places at certain times of the year. It's dark during the winters completely. There's like no sunlight. The summers are short, and they can also be cold. There's dangerous ice, and these folks, this is all they do for a living. They don't really have any other jobs. So they live out there. They actually hunt all their own food. They hunt moose and caribou and squirrels and foxes and wolves and all this sort of stuff, beavers. So it shows them doing that. It shows them preparing and skinning all their food. It shows them dealing with all the problems that exist in those kinds of environments. They have breakdowns in their equipment, their chainsaws freeze, their snowmobiles flip over and break, lose belts and things, and so it shows them basically surviving in this kind of bitter cold wilderness. Most of these people, they do use modern technologies, like they have snowmobiles and chainsaws and things like that, but still, it's about as wild living as you'll get in most places in the world, especially in the United States. Maybe some African tribes or some Native American tribes in Brazil or in the Amazon might be more, more old school. But these guys are pretty old school. So what's amazing about this show, and I recommend you watch a couple seasons of it at least. They've got like 6 seasons. I've watched about 4, after which I got tired. But watch at least a couple. What you'll see is how these people actually survive. And it's illuminating. It's eye-opening. It's amazing because it presents a contrast to ordinary life, ordinary survival, which modern society has made so transparent as to make it virtually invisible. It's really amazing because when you watch these Alaskans living out there, you get this sense that this is how mankind has lived for most of mankind's past. For probably hundreds of thousands of years, mankind has lived this way. And probably not even that long ago, even just 500 years ago, most of mankind lived this way. Most mankind didn't live in cities. But now we live in cities, now we have cell phones, now we have internet and all this sort of stuff. Now we work jobs, we're professionals, we have careers, and we get salaries and paychecks and this sorts of stuff. Healthcare. You don't have any of that out there in the wilderness. Out there, you're caring for yourself. You fall through the ice there, you're dead. You don't get enough food, you're dead. You get the wrong kind of food and it poisons you, you're dead. No one's going to come help you. You break your leg, you're dead. You get eaten by a bear at night, you're dead. That's how it works. So, Why is this important? Might seem like, oh, that's kind of obvious. I already know that. Well, you don't really know that until you see it happening. So if you haven't watched the show, I encourage you to watch the show to actually see it happening, because it's one thing for me to say it. It's a totally different thing for you to actually see it. But as you watch, also try to fit it into the context of self-actualization. And what I mean by that is compare your own life to how those folks live. And notice that really it's interesting. In one sense, your life is completely the opposite of what their life is like. Because you don't go hunt your own food, you don't skin your own animals, you don't do a lot of stuff that they do for themselves. You don't build your own house, you don't cut down your own trees, you don't get your own water. But they do. And that might seem like that's the exact opposite of what you're doing. But from another perspective, it's actually identical to what you're doing. Because both you and they are engaged in the process of survival. That's what that is. Survival is not just keeping yourself alive. Survival is a much broader notion here. Survival means all the stuff you do to basically maintain your life as it is. The problem is that when you're in Alaska, everything there seems like survival, because you're very connected to the sort of organic roots of how our ancestors survived, where we sort of evolved from. But when you're living in New York City, or you're living in the suburb, or wherever you live in a modern civilization, you're still completely engaged in the process of survival. It's just that your process of survival has now transmogrified into some hideous abomination of survival. You don't wake up every morning with the sun rising at the crack of dawn to go fetch your water from the ice lake by cutting a hole in it for an hour with an axe. And you don't go chop down your own pine trees to provide fuel for your furnace to withstand the bitter below zero temperatures. And you don't go hunting for your own quails and ptarmigan or moose to get your food every day. So you don't do any of that. But you do the modern day equivalent of that, which is what? You roll out of bed, you check your smartphone for the news, see what your friends are doing, you maybe log into Facebook, maybe you check that out. Then you get in your car, you got to fuel up your car at the gas station, you got to drive to work on time, you got to be at work. Then you're at work, you got to listen to your manager tell you what you got to do, what the objectives are for the day. Then you get to work, you sit at your computer clicking keys. That clicking keys on your computer is identical to what the hunter is doing when he's aiming his rifle at an animal and shooting it. You're just clicking keys on the keyboard. And when you're checking your email, that's part of that. And then when you're screwing around online and you're just like looking at funny cat videos or something to get away from the work, that's all survival. And you just keep doing that all day. Then you come back home and then you cook yourself some dinner that you bought at a grocery store. So going to the grocery store for you is the same thing as them going out there and looking for birds to hunt. And while they're skinning their catches, you are unwrapping some plastic container that you bought your chicken in or something like that. See? But there's a big difference. The big difference is that really the human organism, human psychology particularly, has not evolved to cope well with working in a cubicle. It's not something that you're really passionate about. Nobody is really passionate about working in a cubicle, looking at a screen for 10 hours, punching keys, answering emails. Whereas when you're walking around in the forests of Alaska, even though it's cold out there and sometimes it's dangerous, there's wolverines and grizzly bears running around and packs of wolves. You have a much deeper, more organic, more human, psychological connection to your work than you do working at a cubicle or flipping burgers at McDonald's. See? It's the difference between working in a factory, cranking out widgets, and doing something that is effortless, that you love. Now, what's interesting is that those people in Alaska, they work really hard. They're always working. And so in a sense, you would never call that effortless. But in another sense, it is effortless, because what they're doing is just, they're going out there and they're doing precisely the things they need to feed and maintain themselves. And then any other time that they have left over is just enjoyed looking at the view. And that's basically it. There's no TV out there. They're not on the internet all day. Although some of them actually do have internet. But the point is that, see, modern society, especially over the last couple hundred years, has really veered away from nature. And human beings are becoming more and more disconnected from nature. And just even in the last 8 years, this problem has significantly worsened with smartphones. And in the next 20 years, this problem will significantly worsen yet again with virtual reality. See? We're constantly connected to the internet, constantly looking at screens here and there. And hey, I'm guilty of it myself because I'm part of this culture. You basically can't be a part of modern culture and not be a part of this disconnection from nature. It's just part of the deal. That's what it means to be part of modern culture. And then, of course, modern culture looks down on all those people who live in the forest, in a cabin in the woods somewhere, those heathens living in the Amazon rainforest, and we look at them and we say, oh, well, look how primitive they are. But see, what you really want in your life is you want a connection to life. You want a passionate life. And you don't have that. Most people don't have that. Why not? Because they spend 8 hours a day working in a factory churning out widgets. And if you think that just because you're not literally working in a factory that you escape this problem, think again. If you're a CEO, guess what? You're still in a factory churning out widgets. If you're a computer programmer who gets paid $200,000 a year, that might sound like a great job. Might sound like you've escaped the rat race, but guess what? You're still just a monkey in a cubicle punching computer keys. You're just getting paid well for it. That's it. There's no difference. No difference at all. And then we wonder why record numbers of people are on antidepressants and on opioids and hate their lives. You have to understand that 20, 50, 100,000 years ago, everybody was an entrepreneur. Do you understand this? Those people who live in Alaska, they're entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurship, the way it is today, it sounds like when I talk about entrepreneurship, it might sound like, oh, well, Leo, you're talking about something for a very small minority of people. Like 1% of people want to be entrepreneurs, and the rest of us, we just want to go to a normal job. No, you don't understand. The human psyche is designed for entrepreneurship. That's what gets you engaged with life. But in modern society, the way that society is structured, very hierarchical, by definition, those at the top are going to control all the power and all the wealth, and there are going to be very few of those because that's the top. That's the apex of the pyramid. You can't have too many of those people. You need a lot more people at the bottom. The people at the bottom are the ones who work for the people at the top. There are these hierarchies. See, these are very unnatural, not organic, and they are soul draining, is the bottom line of it. And so if you hate your life, one of the reasons is because you're stuck in this kind of hierarchy. You're working for somebody you don't know, doing something you don't believe in, You don't even probably know what you're doing precisely in the big picture, but you know you got to do it just to pay your bills. And you're doing it in a cubicle, and it sucks. Fundamentally, it's not any different than what the people in Alaska are doing. The people in Alaska are doing also very repetitive things. If you watch that show for 4 seasons like I did, you'll see that eventually it's just the same old thing. Every day they got to get up, they got to get their water, got to chop some wood, got to make a fire, got to, fix some broken piece of equipment, got to go hunt some animal, got to skin the animal, bring it back, cook it, and then do that day over again. Do it over and over and over again. Every season is basically the same stuff that you did last year, over and over and over again. That's life. Life tends to be cyclical and repetitive. But the difference is that the human psyche has not evolved to be satisfied inside of a cubicle. Whereas it did evolve to be satisfied out in the forest, hunting for animals and gathering mushrooms and whatever needs to be done to survive out there, chopping firewood. It actually did evolve to be satisfied doing that. So ironically, the people who live out in the woods are much more satisfied than your average person working in a cubicle, even though the person working in a cubicle might have a smartphone, might have porn, might have Netflix, might have all these modern advantages. Modern good food, and so on. So the whole tragedy of human civilization is that even though it's making life easier, it's actually making life harder and worse. And the more we become dependent on technology, the more disconnected we get from nature. And of course, the more technologically advanced we get, the more we destroy nature. The easier it becomes to destroy nature. The less remote and wild places there are left in the world. Which is why I had to create my life purpose course. See, most people in modern society need the life purpose course. Because otherwise, without the life purpose course, or unless you figure it out on your own the way that I did for the purposes of the course before I had it, for myself, they are going to be stuck in this sort of cubicle job. And I've been stuck there, and it sucks. Because the human mind is not designed to do that. The human mind is designed to be engaged by being an active entrepreneur, by going out there every day and being connected with what you're doing so that you know how your actions all fit together. You're not just cranking some widget in some black box and you don't know what the end result is or why you're doing it. See, when you're out in Alaska in the wilderness, you know precisely what to do and why it needs to be done, and you're engaged to do it because you're cold. When you're cold, you need to go and gather some firewood. That's very simple. It's not rocket science. You don't need some fancy actualize.org video to convince you to go chop firewood when you're cold. And when you're hungry, you go out and you hunt some squirrels. And you don't need me to tell you that. You don't need me to motivate. You don't need a motivational speech from Leo on actualize.org. Go hunt those squirrels or something bad's gonna. You don't need that. It's obvious to you. You go and do it and you actually enjoy it. But for modern society, you do need me to say these sorts of things to you. And I even need to hear myself say these things to myself because, well, it's very easy to get complacent, to get lazy, to just kind of go with the whole herd mentality of society, to just sit around and play video games all day or watch Netflix or dick around on YouTube or on Facebook or something like that. See? So the more disconnected humanity becomes from our origins without actually changing our genetics and our brain chemistry and our psychology, then the more our psychology is out of attunement with what we're doing on a daily basis. So the more we're disconnected, so the more miserable we're going to feel, the more hollow life will feel, the more we're going to look for substitutes to fill that void that we have inside, that lack of satisfaction, the more we're going to turn to unhealthy and addictive things like potato chips and fast food and porn and drugs and opioids and antidepressants and television and designer clothes and all this sort of silly stuff. The more we're going to want those, the more we're going to need money, the more we're going to need to go back into the system and work even harder in our cubicle to earn money to make us feel better for working in these cubicles. So you see, it's a deadly vicious circle. The more you work in the cubicle, the more money you earn to buy the shit you don't need that will never fulfill you in the first place. The more dissatisfied you feel, the more you turn to the cubicle to work there even harder. And you think that's going to solve your problem, but it's not. You see, you're playing a game you can't win. So that's something you can learn from this show. The other thing you can learn from this show is that even those people living out in the wilderness, as happy as they might say they are or think they are, they're still basically just as miserable as ordinary people living in the city. They still have basically the same problems. Psychologically speaking, these are not self-actualized people. Sure, maybe they're not as dysfunctional because they're not as addicted, because they haven't had to cope with the sadness of living in a giant city, working in a cubicle. So in that sense, they have a little bit less dysfunction. But still, you wouldn't call these deeply spiritual people. None of them are certainly enlightened. None of them even know about enlightenment. I'm pretty confident to make that assumption. And they're just as busy. These people are busy round the clock. They're busy stocking up firewood, busy stocking up water, busy stocking up fish, busy stocking up food for the winter, and they do this all the time. So it's no different than you being busy, clicking away in the cubicle to earn your paycheck. Your paycheck is some digits in a bank account. Their paycheck is some smoked salmon in a shed in the back somewhere that they can use for the next month to feed themselves and their pack of dogs. Not really different. So the lesson there is that it's not really about location. Location is not what's going to make you developed or spiritual. Because you might be thinking like, well, Leo, so are you suggesting maybe that I should just quit society and just go live in Alaska and then I would be happy? And that's not quite what I'm suggesting. First of all, if you really do want to do that, and right now your prospects look bad in the city, sure, go ahead and do that. Of course, be careful what you wish for, because that's a hard life. Watch the show first. It's definitely not a glamorous life. That's going to be a hard transition if you're a city slicker. If you've been pampered your whole life, that's going to be a very hard transition. Very psychologically difficult to do that. You have to be a certain kind of person to do that. You have to be very self-reliant. You have to be very comfortable being alone by yourself with your own thoughts. You have to be disciplined. Without discipline and hard work, you're not going to survive out there. So by no means is it an easy fix. And you're also going to need money, so you can't move out there poor. It's actually quite expensive to live in Alaska. The gas there can be like $10 a gallon. The food there can be expensive. Bush planes can be quite expensive. So you'll need capital to get started no matter what. But see, if you think that's going to solve your self-actualization problems and you think that's going to solve all your neuroses, it won't. It might solve the career problem. It might solve the problem of you sitting in a boring-ass cubicle wasting away your life. It can solve that problem. And don't get me wrong, that's an important problem to solve. And it will connect you to nature. And that's an important piece of living a happy, fulfilled life. But in many cases, it will just be a change in environment without a change in psychology. You see, no matter where you move to in the world, no matter how fancy your house is or how rustic, whether you're living in a hippie commune or in an ashram or in a Zen monastery, or you're living in New York, or you're living, on your own private island, doesn't matter. Your mind is still going to be with you. The dissatisfaction you feel now will come with you. You're not going to leave it by getting on an airplane. And the only ultimate solution to that is consciousness work, self-inquiry, meditation, enlightenment, personal development. This is necessary no matter where you go. And that's something I think those people in Alaska could benefit from, which they lack. So that's another lesson to learn from this show, is even though people can live in radically different ways, ultimately they're all just surviving. But spirituality is something beyond survival. So even though there are less pleasant and more pleasant ways of surviving, and there are certain ways of surviving, like working in a factory, which is very soul draining, and there are other ways of surviving, like hunting all your own fresh meat, which can be very rewarding, I'm pretty sure. That would be quite rewarding, and it'll put you in contact with nature. It still is not going to get you to ultimately the most fulfilling place you can be at in life. So in a sense, that's good news and bad news. It's good news because you don't need to go to Alaska to self-actualize. You don't need to go to Alaska to get enlightened. That's the good news. But also the bad news is that just changing your environment isn't ever going to do it. So you can't run away from your problems, because you are your chief problem. And you go wherever you go. See? So I recommend you watch the show, if you haven't already, and try to look at it from this angle of self-actualization. I found myself learning a lot about how human beings are meant to live compared to how we live now. It shows you many of the dysfunctions within society. So I have a few episodes that I've shot about that in the past. One of them is 30 Ways Society Fucks You in the Ass. Another one I released recently is the deep problem of marketing. So I've railed against culture and society a lot, and for good reason, and you'll see why that is when you watch the show. You want to become more and more aware of the difference between when you're surviving, survival activities, using that broad definition I mentioned, and when you're actually pursuing truth or doing real spiritual work. That can be a very useful distinction to draw. And even though technically there is no such distinction, there really is no difference. Conceptually, it's helpful to draw that distinction, especially when you're just in the early phases of this process, so that you don't trick yourself with thinking that you're being spiritual when actually you're just surviving. All right? It might seem like those folks in Alaska, they're kind of living more spiritual-like because they're more connected to nature. But I would say that's not the case at all. If anything, they're completely absorbed in the process of survival, which is what most animals are up to. Most animals, if you watch some Discovery Channel documentaries, what you see is that most animals are just preoccupied with survival. That's their whole life, is just survival and reproduction. Well, that's what it is for most humans too. For 99% of humans, their life is about nothing but survival and reproduction. And they think that that's all there is. There's nothing else to life. And you might say, well, Leo, but no, I play a lot of video games and I do a lot of entertaining stuff and I go to parties and I take vacations and I eat good food and cuisine and I like to listen to music. So my life is not just about survival and reproduction. No, that's a part of survival and reproduction. Hanging out with your friends, that's a part of survival. Not in the sense that you're going to die if you don't hang out with them, but that's what it means for you to survive. You know, like when a couple of lion cubs are playing with each other, you know, you see them on TV playing with each other, kind of like biting, pouncing on each other. They're playing, but why are they playing? That is part of their survival instinct. Why are human beings playing violent video games where they shoot each other in the face with shotguns, or they shoot other beasts and creatures and animals? Because if you were living in the forest, you would be hunting those animals for real. So these first-person shooter video games, they're not popular by accident. This genre is one of the most popular video games precisely because that's in our ancestors' psychological heritage, is that we're hunters and we're gatherers. So most video games are about what? Hunting and gathering and stockpiling and equipping yourself and strategizing, because that's what human beings have been up to. And if you work at a cubicle, you don't have any of that. You see, when you work in a cubicle or you work at McDonald's, you don't strategize, you don't hunt, you don't gather, you don't stockpile anything. You know, what are you doing? You're punching keys on a keyboard, which is boring as fuck. See? So then you go back home after work, and then you get on the computer, and then you turn on your Call of Duty or your Halo or whatever first-person shooter you like to play, and then you go shooting, blasting people, throwing spears and shooting a crossbow or whatever, you know, you're doing. What is that? You're getting your fix. See, and that entertains you. That actually relaxes you from a whole 10-hour day of punching keys on a keyboard. This here, even though you're still on a keyboard and you're still looking at an LCD screen, it actually relaxes you because for a moment you forget that you're doing this through a computer and you actually think you're in some foreign environment. You're in the forest somewhere. You know, you're in the forests of Skyrim out in the cold hunting dragons, which is what you would normally be doing, except they wouldn't be dragons. They would be like wolves or caribou or moose or something. See? So the perversion of modern society is that it's like the more we get out of touch with nature, the more we need replacements for that. But our modern replacements are so poor that they don't do the job, which is why people get addicted and they get depressed and sad and never quite fulfilled. So think about all that. Think about culture, think about society, think about the history of humanity, think about anthropology, think about psychology, think about business, think about marketing. Think about all of that as you're watching this show, and I think that you'll learn some pretty deep and profound lessons. And besides which, the show is pretty entertaining, so be careful not to binge watch too much of it. After you get the whole gist of all the lessons, you know, maybe by season 4 you get all the lessons out of it, then you probably want to stop by then. So yeah, I just wanted to share that resource with you. And in general, this is a good lesson, is to try to connect everything that I talk about, everything you learn about self-actualization, try to connect it with the real world. Try to connect it with things you see on TV, things you see on YouTube, things you see in the media, things you see in the news. It all should start to make sense. You should start to develop a very broad understanding of the psychological drivers of all human beings, no matter where they are, whether they're terrorists, whether they're Native Americans, whether they're politicians or they're CEOs, you know, or they're men or they're women or they're minorities or they're whoever. You should get a really good understanding of their psychology and why these people do what they do. And it's got very little to do with the color of their skin or the country they live in or the belief system they subscribe to. See? It's all about the operations of the mind, sort of the frameworks, the meta-beliefs that they have. Not the basic beliefs, but the meta-beliefs. The beliefs underneath the beliefs. And the culture that they're a part of. How all that plays into shaping how you live, and then, of course, how you live shapes how you feel. So all of it is very pertinent to figuring out what you want to do in life. And also, it's quite beneficial. For example, if you're trying to find your life purpose, maybe you've taken my course, you're halfway through the course right now, and you're feeling a little stuck or a little confused, is to explore how other people make a living. So you start to think outside the box. When you start to see someone making a good living, living out in the middle of Alaska, in the middle of nowhere, in a cabin, hunting wolves and foxes for pelts and selling those pelts and making a pretty good living doing that, that opens up your horizons. You're like, oh, damn, I could do that. How could I maybe connect that with my life purpose? You know? And of course, not just that. There's lots of different documentaries you can watch that will reveal to you how various people live and make a living, which can help you to kind of broaden your horizons, think outside the box, and then figure out what might be right for you. By no means am I saying that living in Alaska is right for everybody. Definitely not. Probably for most people it's not. It's just an interesting alternative to consider. Because it's rare that you get to consider alternatives to mainstream Western civilized living. You know, most people live in an apartment, or they live in a condo, or they live in a traditional house. And they don't know any other way. And most people work for a company, a giant corporation, in a cubicle somewhere, or flipping burgers, or doing some kind of mundane administrative stuff. And they don't know any other way. Well, there are many, many, many other ways. This Alaska thing, this is just one tip of the iceberg of all the other alternative, interesting lifestyles that you can have. So if you're dissatisfied with your life, or maybe you're going to college and you feel like, oh man, this college thing isn't for me. I don't really want to be a lawyer, a doctor, or an engineer, any of those traditional vocations, then know that with research, you can discover a lot of interesting and cool ways to survive in the world, not just to survive, but to actually thrive and to enjoy yourself, which could not only be good ways of making a living, but they could actually be great ways of living, much better than being a CEO of some giant company. So if you're this kind of person that just can't motivate himself or herself to do the traditional 9-to-5 type of job, that's fine. It doesn't mean there's something wrong with you necessarily. It doesn't necessarily mean you're lazy. It just might mean that that lifestyle doesn't fit your values. It doesn't motivate you for whatever reasons. And maybe that means because you crave a deep connection with nature. And if that's the case, fine. Go design that. Create that. First of all, you got to realize, okay, that's what I need. That's part of my value system. Then you got to realize, okay, so I got to create a vision for that. So you create a vision. Then you got to say, okay, so how can I make it happen? To make it happen, you got to go do the research to see what are the possibilities. See, most people have done so little research that they don't even know that these possibilities exist. So I definitely recommend that you broaden your horizons and start thinking outside the box.